And so let me first start with encoding, so predicting brain responses from stimuli. So the methodology of encoding is that we're building a model of brain responses and we're tuning it on brain activity. And if we're doing this with machine learning, we're going to test this model on left out brain activity. Okay, so we're going to build a model of brain activity given the behavior, and we're going to use, you know, computational modeling, which is basically statistical machine learning, to do this. And then we're going to test whether this model explains well left out brain activity. So if we think about standard analysis, it's actually not that different. So the way standard analysis really works is that we have stimuli, so elementary psychological manipulations. We could have, you know, one stimuli, for instance, a horizontal checkerboard, and another stimuli. And we're going to model the brain response to the stimuli. We're going to you model it using a linear model. That's the standard model. And basically, we're describing the brain activity as a linear function of the conditions. And then what we're going to do is that we're going to basically, you know, contrast those brain maps and conclude things on brain activity. So it's, in a sense, standard analysis is an encoding model. It's just not using machine learning methods. And so standard analysis, and more than standard analysis, a long history of work in neuroscience, has come up with models, conceptual models, such as that of the visual system. So the idea being that historically, people have decomposed the stimuli, so the visual stimuli, in elementary aspects of the stimuli, and have mapped the response to the stimuli, starting with Hubel and Wiesel, who did experiments by moving a line. So they crafted a specific stimuli, they moved the line, and they showed that V1 responds very well to these edges. And so the model of V1 is an edge vector. And so people have, you know, come up with more and more complex stimuli and shown that different regions of the brain responds rather specifically to these more and more complex decompositions of the stimuli. And so we have this idea of a cascade, basically, of regions that are tuned to different aspects of the stimuli, and, you know, going from low level to high level, ending up with regions such as the fusiform face area, which is understood as being tuned to faces. And so this whole, you know, agenda has worked by crafting features of images and presenting them to individuals, human or non-humans, and testing brain response. And so we can, you know, ask questions such as, is there a face region? We could also, you know, try to contrast foot with face and see there's a difference between foot and face. We can, you know, ask whether there's a left big toe region. You know, maybe there's a left big toe neuron in the brain. And so if I want to do this, I'll build an experiment and I will craft stimuli to reveal the left big toe region, and I will acquire lots of data, because I want, you know, statistical power, and then I'll do a contrast, I'll oppose this, and most chances is I will find a difference. Why will I find a difference? Because you can never balance everything. And then I'll publish this, and maybe I won't be able to publish this in a good journal because, well, there's no real, you know, psychological theory of the left big toe region. But this is showing us the shortcoming of this approach, is that our mapping using the standard analysis, this standard approach, relies on cognitive subtraction. So basically the idea that between my two stimuli or my two conditions, there's a meaningful elementary cognitive difference, a meaningful elementary psychological manipulation. And this by itself is bound to decomposing mental processes. So this by itself is bound to a model of the mental processes that are happening in the conditions. So it only tests a given theory of the mind only inside its paradigm. If I believe in the whole paradigm that encompasses decomposing the stimuli a certain way, then I believe that the mapping that I get is relevant. Now, if I don't believe in the paradigm, then I can challenge the mapping, the left big toe region, because I say, I don't believe in your paradigm, I'm challenging the mapping, the difference that you are getting is not relevant. So in a sense, this approach is basically testing some form of internal consistency and mapping some form of internal consistency. I am not fully satisfied by this. So how do we decompose visual stimuli? And how do we do this in a principled way? Well, if we look at the low-level visual cortex, there's a long running hypothesis that the reason it is tuned to edges is because it's tuned to the statistics of natural images. These are, there are many ways you can analyze natural images, and when you do this, you find that the fundamental statistics of natural images are basically edges or Gabor filters. And so in a similar way, what drives high-level representations of natural images? And one way of thinking of this problem is to look at our most advanced computational modeling of natural images, and these have been developed in computer vision, and they're basically convolutional neural networks. And what convolutional neural networks do is that they build more and more complex transformations of the inputs. I have an input, and the first layer is basically some form of edge detector Gabor filter. And then on top of this, I'm building a more complex transformation, and I'm detecting it. And again, and again, and again. And so what we're seeing here is that convolutional neural networks, which are tools that are really tuned to best solved object recognition problems on natural images, what we see is that they really extract a hierarchy of representations that are more and more complex. And so these representations are driven by the statistics of the natural images and by the task that we're asking, which is visual object recognition. So it makes sense to use these representations to probe the brain, because these are the best representations that we get, these days to solve the problem of natural image, object recognition in natural images. So what we can do then is to use representations of the stimuli that people are looking at to map brain responses. So we're basically going to show images to people, and we're going to feed those images in a convolutional neural net. We're going to obtain transformations of those images, so representations. The lower level ones will be edge detectors, and as we go, we'll have more and more complex representations. And then we can ask, do those representations explain well brain activity? And when we're doing this, we're using an encoding approach. And so if we do this, and when we do this, we are going to have to, so we're going to get very complex representation. If I take a natural image, it has many different edges. So if I describe it in terms of its Gabor filters, I have a very large number of covariates. And to do this, to address this from a statistical standpoint, I will need to use machine learning approaches, and I will need to use things such as out-of-sample prediction to establish the validity of my model, because my model has too many features and is not amenable to standard statistics. So if we do this, and if we look at which areas of the brain respond best to a model, are best described by a model that is built from the low-level features, so Gabor filters, or the mid-level features, or the high-level features. So each time we're looking at which part of the brain responds best, is best explained by an encoding model. So what we're seeing is that the low-level features are best explained by the primary visual cortex. And as we move up the ladder of the hierarchy, what we're seeing is that higher-level descriptions map better higher-level regions. So this is an argument to tell us that the representations that the neural network is building are actually good representations of the stimuli to explain the brain responses. So in another way, the brain responses are probably tightly related to those representations. So once we've done this, we can do things such as taking our model. So now we have a model which takes a natural image natural images, transforms them into representations of the input image, and then predicts the brain activity. So we can predict the brain activity given the natural image. So once we have this, then we can start doing things such as probing our model. For instance, doing a standard retinotopy analysis, but on the predicted activity and not on recorded activity. And so if we do this, we find fairly classic retinotopic maps that have been built from our model of the response of the brain to natural images. We can also do standard experiments such as contrasting faces and places. And so based on our model, and if we do this, we find that our model predicts that there is going to be a difference between faces and places in areas such as the FFA and the PPA, so in the corresponding areas of the brain. So why is this interesting? It's interesting because it's giving us a strong generalization because we're going from a paradigm that is built on natural images with results that are related to natural images, and we're showing that they're carrying over to different stimuli with different statistics. So our natural images were in color. The stimuli that we're testing here are black and white. They're framed. They're much more artificial, faces and houses. So what we have here is that we have results that have a wider validity. They go from some form of ecological validity, which is with natural images, to some form of experimental validity, which is with synthetic images of faces and places. So the reason I'm excited about this is this strong generalization that gives a wider validity to our results. And this generalization is possible only because we're using predictive models, hence machine learning tools. So really the idea here is that when we're using encoding instead of a classic standard analysis, we can have predictive models, we can train them on much richer stimuli, and so we can basically build methods of fMRI that go beyond a handful of contrasts and that test cognitive models beyond simple dissociations such as opposing faces and places. Because once again, those simple dissociations are only interpretable inside the cognitive theory that underlies the event. Whereas a predictive model can make predictions that go beyond this and be tested beyond a set of stimuli.